Now let's bring in Mark Dreyer, founder of China Sports Insider, to discuss how athletes around the world are preparing for these Winter Games, and in particular, the issue of gender equality in sports. Thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure.
So broadly speaking first, is there a big difference in the investment that countries make between their male Olympians and their female Olympians?
I think at the Olympic level, it's generally pretty even. Often countries will have sort of performance-based targets and goals for athletes to hit, and so it doesn't really matter if you're a man or a woman. Where the discrepancy sometimes comes in is when there's already a well-established professional sport. The Olympics, of course, started as an amateur sport, so we have some differences there. So for example, soccer, where it's very well established as a professional sport, you'll see much more discrepancy in the pay divide when you come back down to sort of the Olympic level.
So then, as we look at just the country level for some of these non-professional sports, what about China? How does the gender pay gap differ there?
Well, the Chinese system and the funding for the Olympic system is really quite different because it comes from a national level, and frankly, it's extremely well funded. China has all the resources and the money that it needs. Historically, the women have actually slightly outperformed the men over the years, not just in terms of representation, in terms of athletes. We saw more female athletes. About 60% of the Chinese team in Tokyo were females. That was partly because some of the teams, the Chinese teams on the women's side qualified and the men didn't. So there's more athletes, but they've also won more medals as well. And so that will kind of fund into, go into how the funding is distributed, and people are sort of, they try to be more strategic about it. Where can we win the medals? Right. Where can we push our resources and our development to try and maximize that effect when it comes to the top end, and of course winning medals at the Olympics.
And to that point, we know that the Chinese women's hockey team has had international success while the men's team has not. So does the women's team get the same level of support, both financially and infrastructure-wise and training and things like that, as the men's side?
Well, it's an interesting question. I wouldn't necessarily say that they've had success, although they have qualified by right for the Olympics in 3 previous editions, whereas the men will be making their debut in Beijing. For the women's hockey establishment, actually, the Chinese women's team are incredibly well funded, and when they had their domestic team in the North American Women's Hockey League a couple of years ago, that was sort of unprecedented levels of support for the Chinese team, and in fact that spread out to some of the other North American teams investing as well. So the men, compared with other more established professional teams, are probably slightly underfunded, but I think at the Olympic level the men will probably get more than the women. So it's kind of a little bit relative, and it depends on which angle you're coming at it from.
And you did mention that distinction between sort of the pro sports versus the Olympic sports. And you did mention soccer. And here in the US, obviously, we know that the women's team has historically outperformed the men's team, yet isn't paid as well. Do we know when or how that dynamic starts to change?
A lot of it, I think, comes down to player pressure. We've seen in tennis, for example, over many years that women and in fact some of the men's players have sort of been fighting for pay equality, because when you have very comparable Grand Slam tournaments and equal coverage, and there's tournaments running concurrently at the same time, it's quite hard to argue that it's a different competition with different fans. And in fact, when the WTA finals were announced for the Shenzhen tournament, their big season-ending tournament, they actually had more money at that time for their season-ending tournament here in China than the men did for their equivalent title. Unfortunately, that was a bit of an anomaly, and the men have since caught up. But I think some sports sort of look towards tennis as that sort of equality, and sort of that is the gold standard in terms of erasing the pay gap in sports.
And as you mentioned, tennis is one of those few sports where we're seeing the gender pay gap is closer. But when you look at professional basketball, say in the US, they're the furthest apart. On average, $8 million is the average compensation for a male basketball player versus $75,000 for women, according to a study by Adelphi University. So what are the biggest determining factors that go into determining sports salaries and really eventually perhaps making them more comparable?
I think the first thing starts with exposure. It takes everyone from all sides to really give the women's game at all levels a boost. it needs the men's professional side, and we see this more in some sports than in others, to kind of give some funding support to the women's leagues. I think people who go to watch women's sports are incredibly impressed and often surprised at just how good the level is. That shouldn't be the case. It shouldn't be a surprise that women are just as good athletically as the men. And so we need more exposure from the media. We need more sponsorship because that all leads to funding for the game. We can't expect athletes to be amateurs and yet still competing at the top level and still competing at an equivalent level to their male professional counterparts. So there's a lot of different factors that go into this, but I think exposure from the media and support from the men's side are some of the key factors.